All right, we're back. We're talking about React and React Router and how within this single page application or however you're using React, you may need to may need to transition the page. You may need a mechanism to give the impression that you are navigating throughout the site, when in fact we have a mechanism that is basically reloading components and handling all of this kind of routing in your page, right? And we want something that is easy to use inside of React. So the React router is a library you can use. And remember, React itself is just a component library. We say at the beginning it's just for rendering UI components, and now because it's not a framework like Angular that has all this stuff baked in, now we have to go external and start finding other libraries to use. And this is what this package is all about. So quickly going to go over a few things: basic routes, multiple routes, route parameters, and navigating with history, the history API. I'm going to go back to a code example and kind of show how we can use all this and build this out. So routing, you want a clear and concise way of knowing the direction you're going to go. You want a clear way for your application to route and handle this kind of direction of loading, right? Loading components, taking requests, loading the right component, giving the impression that the page is transitioning, when in fact we have components that are hide showing in the virtual DOM. But we want a clear way that we can identify routes and handle routes. So there's a React router library out there that's the most popular, and there's many out there, but this is the one that's most commonly used for routing. Again, like we said, React is like pick your own adventure, so you need to find something that you're comfortable with. This is not, again, we always said that React is opinionated, meaning that there are a lot of opinions out there, and I'm sure there's another version of this out there, a couple other really popular ones out there, but this is the one that's most commonly used with React. At the time of this slide, it was version 4.0, but right now it's the version 5.1.2, I believe, all backward compatible. They have just extended it a little bit with a couple additional features that we may talk about. So the reason why you want to use routing is because as your application grows, it's good to use a router to help manage, as we said, the transition between views, redirects, and get URL parameters. Because if you've ever worked in vanilla JavaScript, if you've ever had to deal with redirects and then handling those redirects, sometimes it can get quite messy. Sometimes you have to reload the whole window and those kind of things, and you get a page refresh, and it's not the ideal user experience, right? We want to stay within the virtual DOM. We want things to be quickly quickly swapped out without having to give the impression that the page is really undergoing a postback, right? That old postback we keep talking about from those older technologies. I'm not going to name that one that I want to keep talking about, but anyhow, so it allows you to define your routes declaratively. And basically the API is just components. So if you've already used React components, you're in luck. These are just components that JSX will understand. They got value props, right? I mean, this is what we're already used to, and this follows that same pattern. So quickly to set it up, of course, you're going to use npm install to go and grab it from the npm registry. It's comprised of three packages: React Router DOM, and then React Router Native. Of course, probably Native is the one we're not going to be using because we're not dealing with mobile applications. So React Router composes all the core routing components. React Router DOM comprises the routing API required for browsers. Of course, Native is for mobile applications. And when, of course, you install this, you can check your package.json and check the dependencies, and you'll see that they're all there. So okay, again, basic routing. So remember when we refer back to Angular had a router module already built in, and you'd go through and you'd build your routes that way, and you had various different things that you needed to be aware of. But here, we just following that same pattern of components. And there's two types of components that you're going to use in your web application. It's browser router is the main one, and then hash router, the latter being for maybe more older browsers. So that browser router tag, it uses that HTML5 history API. There's push, pop, replace state, and it keeps your URL in sync with that. Without using the HTML5 API, makes it quite easily to kind of transition, and this is built upon that. So again, the hash router gives you that old anchor tag, that hash in the URL, and some of the older legacy browsers, they recommend you use the hash router. So anyhow, this is an important statement right here. So we're using import, we're using destructuring, we're pulling out browser router and route from that React Router DOM library. And then once we have those things, we have what we need to start building on our route. So setting up the basic route, as we said, we import that. Those are the main things imported from React Router DOM. Then we have our app component. We wrap it. We wrap that entire JSX at return. It could be just that one main container tag. And again, just like when we talk about context API, that we'll talk about later on for state, as soon as you wrap this tag, this component, then any of its child components now have access to routing. The same way we could talk about context API is when you actually wrap the child components in it, then it has all those components in that component tree now share context, which means state. So we'll talk about context API because it's quite powerful, and if you've been dealing with problems with state and understanding it, we'll get into that in the next sessions. But in the same vein, when we are working in this main app, which is the application, we want to wrap our entire application, if needed, in browser router, and then we can define our routes in the underlying child components. And then basically it serves as a container for every other route component. So that's the first step. The router component can only have one child element or component, like we said. So basically that's how we set this up. So when we are defining routes, again, we're actually pulling in a little bit more when we're defining the routes. So this is important. Link. So link is important for moving you're building a navigation bar. Say, and we'll look at this in a second. So in this example here, we have the div tag that builds out like a little bit of a navigation above. So all the code is kind of here. You can extract all that into a navigation component to make it a little cleaner. And then of course you have your switch and your browser, sorry, your switch and your route tags, which is handling the basically the case statements of the path, the URL, and that link there should be the links upon atop of some kind of navigation bar. So when you click it, the value prop is 2 is basically going to trigger that URL to be redirected, and then falling into the switch statement. So we'll quickly look at that. So again, the to string represents the location of the link. The to object with properties, path name, search, and hashtags. So there's a couple ways that you can go about it. And if you notice, we'll look at this in a second. Switch, we'll look at that. Switch renders the first child, router, or redirect that matches the location. Of course, if we already dealt with Angular, we knew the concept of wildcarding and matching. So anyhow, let's just quickly look at an application here. And I'll just fire it up, and let me pause this while it loads up so you don't have to sit here and watch it load. All right, we have this loaded up now. So we have an application, a simple application here that has a banner with a bit of styling, and we have 2 links that we want to have here. So this is the list. We've extracted this out into a navigation panel, but we want something to click on. We want to be able to trigger that route. So we're gonna first go to this extracted nav component. So we have a navigation component, and it's just a simple component, functional component. Add some style I'm going to use here, and it's just a nav bar that has a couple of list items, repo and user, and we want to add some type of routing to this. So what they suggest is we need to have that click element. So we need to walk up to import. We need to import link using destructuring from, and what was it? It was React router DOM. So we have that. So now we have this link function, right? So it's just a component. And what we need to do is go to our list items, and we need to wrap those. Again, we need to wrap it, so anything underneath it is a child component, but we have a link component here, and we can pretty much put this repo tag in there as a child component, and we want to go ahead and link the same thing. So using link, we're going to wrap this user as well inside of that, and then we can quickly. All right, so I have Prettier installed, so I'm sure if I save it, it might make it a little bit nicer. Okay, there we go. So that by itself isn't much, and I'm sure if we go back, will it hover over it? Okay, you should not use a link outside the right tag. We'll handle that in a second. So what we need to do is we want to build. We're using the to prop. We want to be able to handle our route. So maybe we'll call this repo, and we'll put a to route to users. So what will happen is when we click on this, it's going to go and trigger the URL to handle that, to go and redirect on that route. So that error is happening there. And by the way, I think I wanted to add a class name. So I wanted to have a pre-baked style to have the text in white, I believe. So I'm just using that, if you notice, the JSX syntax, camel casing. And I'm going to set it to nav style. Nav style. I may have to put parentheses around those. I'll have to double check. Anyhow, we'll go like this, copy it, and bring it down to the link element. And all right, so we should be good there. I may need to actually evaluate that as a style. I'll have to check that in a second. So we go back to the app.js, and now we have this basic nav bar, but because we have that error, it's because we haven't wrapped the whole application inside a browser router. So now I have a bunch of components already loaded up. I have the repo, I have the user, it's already there. So I just want to display them based on the URL. So I'm going to go and use destruction again. I'm going to import. I'm going to grab browser router, and I'm going to grab route from React router DOM. Oops. Okay, I'm sorry. React. That's what happens in live programming. Well, this isn't really live, but you know what I'm saying. All right, so now that I have these items here from React Router DOM, I need to go into my app component here, and I need to wrap all of this inside of browser router. Browser router. So now when I wrap that, anything inside my application has the ability to route. So it basically is like a container. I have a browser router container. And you know what, maybe if I don't like this browser router, I can simply alias this to something shorter, say router. So I like that a little bit better. So now I can actually understand I have a router tag, so I'm just aliasing this. Is that how you say it? So I have that. So I have router, browser router encapsulating all across my application. Let's see if that error went away. It did go away. So I have these links here. They're not looking too great. I think the style didn't take, but when I click it, you can see the URL is changing, but nothing is happening, right? So it is actually changing, and I believe my style has to be changed on that as well. I'll fix that in a second. All right, so what's next? So we have the browser router, and now we need to create the routes, right? Because we have the links used in other paths, so we need to create some routes in here. So outside this main tag, we can define our routes. So we can have a route, and we build out our routes here. So, all right, so let me just check for a second here and load up, see this error, this error is happening. I'll just pause this quickly and deal with it. To be honest, I lied. I just wanted to check to see why the styling wasn't working. So it was what I was thinking. I need to actually evaluate this in a different way so it actually will apply the style, get rid of those strings, because that was actually really bothering me. So let's actually do this and evaluate as an expression, right? We're evaluating as an expression. We go back to our nav here. We don't need this class name on the app anymore. So we can have this set up here, and we don't need, so now we have this. All right, let's take a look if the page is actually looking a little better or throwing an error. So it still has those links there because we probably haven't set it up in that way. So we can actually take a look at this. So we have our routes. So we have one route here, and what we want to do is we want to go and we want to have, there's something called path. So now we're actually dealing with the routes, right? So if we have, say, repo /repo URL, we want to show component. We want to show the component, and we want to have it evaluate the repo component. All right, so that's one route. All right, so now we want to build another route path. We want to say path equals to user, and we want to display the component that is a user. All right. So let's see if that handles it. If we can handle the URL with routing. All right, so it's saying router, so we want route. I want to rebuild quickly, and when we are, all right, so it says user is not defined, but we have users. Users. All right. So let's see if we're actually handling this. All right, so right away, you can see /repo is handling this. I have this baked component already. When I click the user, let's see. So users should be displayed, right? And inside my user component, I have a list of those GitHub lists that we're using from that API, that preset API. So we already know that it is actually routing. The only problem is now is when we actually enter a slash, it won't know what to do. There's no default, right? So we need to fix some of this. So we need to actually, maybe if we wanted to have the initial slash to be a home component, we need to actually add a home component. So we're going to quickly do that. I'll pause that because I don't want to have a baked component for that already. So let me just pause it. All right, so I had a baked component already that was just a functional component, and all it was is outside of my app. I didn't want to create another file for it. Just a functional component that's going to return home. So we want that that kind of the initial slash kind of default page to go to the home component. So I create another route, path equals to just slash, and we want to load that component up. And we're going to create our own problem here by doing this. So we have this home component. You've seen this in Angular already, and we probably kind of know what's going to happen. Again, it's not router, it's route. All right, so we have these routes here. And then we need to go back. So if you notice right here, now all of a sudden, two components are showing. Every time we log to repo or to user, now we got this component showing up, because what's happening now is it's actually on that first slash, it's actually evaluating that home is also the component to show as well as the repo. So what we may need to do is we may to put this keyword on this called exact, right? So, but we may actually cause another problem as well, the same problem. So let's see what happens. All right, so if we're user slash this, so if we actually go to slash home, we actually get home. There will be another problem, and the other problem may be when we try to extend user detail. But for now, this is loading as expected. So we have the home, that case is being met, and then we go to repo. It's actually routing to repo and showing that component. When you go to users, it's actually handling that as well. So right now it is working as expected. However, if we wanted to then, I'm going to fix the style in a second. It should be centered, but I'll do that in a bit. So if we wanted to then go to the next step, if we wanted to say, look at user detail. So if we wanted to, in this component I have it, if you see it, it's going to pass an ID. And we want to be able to navigate based on the same path to a different details page. We have to do something about that. We got to be able to use the route parameters, because if you notice, it's not going anywhere because it has no match. There is no default, so it's just an empty page. So we need to actually go into find a way that we can pass a route parameter and do some more further matching. So we'll take a look at that. All right, let me just load up the slides and we'll take. All right, so going back to the slides, we did what we said here. We included all those. We didn't include the switch yet because we haven't run into that problem. But however, we're using the link. The switch will basically do the first match and stop. So if there's multiple matches, it'll stop. So it's a good safeguard. We'll use that in a second. So we have defining multiple routes. So we've already done this already, and this is where exact comes into play, because we need that exact. Without that exact, as we notice, that home component will show. It'll also show any other components. So if you click contact, home and contact will show. This is not what we want. We don't want that. We also had an error component if no match is found. That's a good way. We didn't actually add that, so that would be the default. And then again, nav link can be in place of so you can actually use link, but if you want to put some additional styling on the active link, you can use this nav link. But we're really after this route parameter, so we need to set this up because we want to handle the user details. So this is a way that we can, and it's similar to Angular, to be honest, right? The slash colon slash after the slash, it grabs the student number in this. It's just a way of doing further matching. So if we had a student Randy Savage and we had a student Lex Luger with this ID, it'll go to the same component, because this wildcard matching helps. It's optional parameters, but it basically allows the route to handle that. So parameterized route, any segment that starts with a colon will be treated as a parameter. So student name will be a parameter, and student number will be a parameter. Optional parameters are defined by placing a question mark at the end of the parameter. So that's key to know. So we need to set up the user details in that way. And let's see, we'll basically do this we'll come back to this in a second, but we'll come back to this. Let me just load that up, and we'll take a look at that application with the parameterized routes. All right, did a couple things here just to quickly demonstrate. We didn't actually show what switch did, so it's a good idea to actually show what it does, because I removed that exact off there. So if I have that exact off there, we get into the same problem where we have the home component showing, right, and that's not ideal. So if we weren't using exact, we could use this switch statement. So the switch will basically stop after the first match is found. Now we get into this problem now is that anytime we click this, whether it's repo or whether it's users, it's always returning the home. So basically what switch does is it stops after the first match and doesn't continue on allowing other matches, which is a good thing. But then if we go along to be safe, we put that exact on there, and now we have that component that we have that functionality we want. I actually also centered this, so it looks a little nicer. Anyhow, so if we want to now dig into the route parameters, now when we click this, it'll load up the details. It goes and calls and makes another Axios call. So perfectly, we'll go and trigger that for us. So now we look at how we accomplish that. So we have this route parameter, and it's the same /user, and now we have colon ID, and based on that, well, we're going to display a component called component details. Now there's another thing we need to talk about when we go into component details, because now we need to pass that ID into the component details, and we need to go and trigger another Axios call to go and get specifically that user from the backend service. So we need to look at how we do that. And how we do that is we do this by something called route parameters. So route parameters it's a way of passing the parameter into the component as a prop. So there's this if you notice up here, there's something called match, and match is evaluated, so it's automatically passed into the component. If you remember, Angular had something, a couple ways of doing this. It had something called I think it was router.snapshot, and through the snapshot you can grab the router parameters, but you had to do injection. You had to inject into the constructor, do some dependency injection. In this way, I guess it doesn't exactly work the same, but I guess it does do some kind of injection, and it puts this match in there, and on that match there's a dot params, and you can use destruction to pull out some of those parameters. So optional parameters are passed alongside the mandatory ones, so if you have a question mark there, it'll be undefined if it's not in the URL. The URL is passed in something called match.url. So we have access to the URL, we have access to the parameters, we have access to the route path in terms of match.path. So we have all these things here that we can work with inside internally of this component, and that's important because we need to know we need to know some of the URL parameters, especially if we're working with an ID and we want to trigger some kind of call, right? So we'll go into the code and look at that, how we did that. Let me just load that up for a second. Load up, but what I didn't show you, I gotta take a step back here. What I didn't actually show you is how to build these links out. So how would I build these links out and pass the ID and click to the user details? So we didn't actually look at that component. This is called the user component. And what we did is we imported link and we imported Axios. Now there's some things I'm holding back here, and that's because I'm going to talk about state in the other in another session. I'm going to show how to use state for this, but for right now, just suspend relief and know that fetch is being called through some lifecycle method, right? If you don't know, what I'm getting at is when we're in a functional component, we don't have lifecycle, but with the help of hooks, we will. So I'm kind of excluding that because I'm going to cover that in the next session. But suspend reality for a second and know that when we come in, it's going to fetch a JSON placeholder, get the users, and then it's going to set state to data. And just suspend reality, realize that we have this concept of data there, but what we're really after is we're mapping over the items that come back. And what we're really after is we're using this link and we're building out that route, right? You can see link to the prop is users. I'm passing in the ID. And through there, when I click on that, it's going to go back to our app.js and fall into this route in our switch statement. And then it's going to show the user detail component. And then we need to pass in this parameter into the component. Automatically, it'll actually go into that match.prop. Again, this is another functional component that just pretend there is state there. I'm not showing it at the second. And it does get this match parameter, and on component load, it will actually trigger this call with match.params.id. And once it gets the data back, then we will go and set state, and we'll actually display that item has come back. And that's how that's working in this application, how we got the routes to work and how to pass in parameters and have this kind of interaction. And if you notice, the page is not refreshing, it's not posting back. It's exactly what we're looking for. So I really got 5 slides left, so stay with me, and we're almost done. So we wanted to talk about nested routes. I don't have an example for that, but I have some code examples here. So nesting API in React. So it's route's just a component, just like a div. So to nest a route, you just create another component with a route in it. So if you have browser router in your app, you have a route path to tacos. I feel like a taco right now. We have a taco component, and when it matches taco, it loads a functional component called tacos. And inside of that, we have the match. And again, we do another nested route inside of that. So we have another route. So we might have another only access to that if once we load this component up and we have some type of inside of that component, it can click another route. It'll handle it only within this component. So here's a nested route. Match URL helps make a relative path. So now we can use that URL. We can use /tacos, and we can ask /carnitas, and we can show the component carnitas, right? So we're actually adding another nested route to this in that way. So again, the thing to take away is we are actually, through this match parameter that we're getting through destructuring some kind of injection, we are then on that, we have match.url that we can then use to build another route. So somebody asked me, how do we programmatically from, say you log in and you want to redirect from that component to the admin screen, how would you do that in code in JavaScript? So what you're going to use is the history package, and that's provides that core functionality for the router. The history package is what it's all based on, the HTML5 history API. And that allows us to easily add location-based navigation on the client side. 3 types of history: browser history, hash history, and memory history. And we create history objects so we don't interact with them directly, right? We actually are indirectly working with this API. And these are how you import it: through destructuring. Create browser history, hash history, memory history. We're focusing on browser history, and that's how we're going to use it. And once we get that, we have a simple little API in it. We have push, go forward, go back, go forward. 90% of the time, you're going to probably be using push, right? So when you do history.push/repo or whatever, you're going to trigger from the code a way of rerouting the whole application and reloading that component. So the push method allows you to go to a new location and change the current location. By default, when you click on the link from the React router, it'll use history.push when you navigate. So when you click that internally, it's using this already. And again, we have these other related methods. If you've ever used vanilla JavaScript, you can use them, but you don't necessarily use them very much, to be honest. And the last slide, I promise, as far as I know, it's not going to be anything else after this. So again, when you dealt with Angular, you wanted to protect your routes. For instance, if you have some JWT token or something in local storage to say that you are now logged in, you want to protect your admin routes. You can do it in the same way with Angular as you can with React. So the routes you can add to these routes. You can add this kind of simple expression here. It's handled a little differently, right? You had like the router guard in Angular, some kind of attribute. Here we're just using a JavaScript statement. We're basically saying that we have this expression that's going to be built. Maybe we have this has role method we already determined that takes a user and takes some type of some type of role, and we actually figure out in that function, that piece of logic that we created, that true false, he has it or not. And then we basically and it with the component itself. It's basically saying, does the user have the role user? Is he a guest? And the path matches /user. If so, then we allow it to show. Otherwise, that evaluation will return false and not be available inside the switch statement. Same thing if the user is admin and the path is /admin, then we actually show the component. Otherwise, we fall to error. So in a nutshell, we actually covered React Router. We covered all those statements, how to navigate, how to set up a navigation list, how to pass route parameters, and then how to do some basic routing from programming in JavaScript, and then how to do some simple authentication. So I kind of held back on some stuff, mostly because we're using next session we're going to talk about state and React hooks. I'll go back to this example and show how I actually did that and then build upon it. And anyhow, we have a little bit more to do, but once we put it all together, it's going to seem really great, and you're going to be able to build your own application uh, as you would want to. All right. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.